of the key issues taken up by India, including food security, energy, development, health, and digitalization, which would you say received an especially strong fillip under India's presidency?
I think India's presidency, Tanvi, would be remembered for dozens and dozens of firsts that India has introduced. And they are going to stay with the G21, as we now call it, for the coming years.
Yes.
Particularly because, as Ambassador mentioned, the focus of bringing the global south to the center stage, both in terms of issues that are held dear and are relevant for global south, also perspectives and strategies that global south wants to bring to the high table in that sense. So we saw both before India started various meetings of the G20. We had the first Voice of the Global South Summit in January, attended by 125 countries. Again, before we close our presidency with this online summit meeting today, we saw recently another second Voice of the Global South Summit attended by 130 countries. So both there is a of the global south of what India is trying to achieve in terms of building a bridge between the global south or nations that were staying on the periphery of global governance to bring them to the very center stage. I think that is a fundamental change that India has brought about, and my hope and confidence that this change will sustain itself and get reinforced comes from the fact that in coming years also it is the global south countries that are holding presidency. Brazil will take over from 1st of December, followed by South Africa. And if you remember, the Troika leadership of G20 like this, that India, Brazil, South Africa will be for the coming year as well. And we all understand we have had this whole experience of IBSA, India, Brazil, South Africa, three democracies working together. So they have a sufficient understanding of working together and coordination. So it should be possible for India to continue with issues that it has brought to the table and try to change those, very thought process fundamentally. So whether you look at the quantity of things, the size of recommendation, the number of meetings, the number of cities where meetings happened, number of participants that joined us, 100,000 foreign delegates joined in various meetings. 7 to 8 million Indian citizens were directly or indirectly involved in various meetings. 11 international organizations, 9 special, and so on. And of course, African Union with 55 countries coming. So the quantity itself is a good measure of change. And then, of course, quality again is a good measure of change. For the first time, G20 is no longer G20, it is now G21 in that sense. And for the first time, it is happening that India's presidency is seeing 2 summit meetings. One in-person summit meeting, September, followed now by an online summit meeting, fundamentally to do 2 things. One, to deliberate about have we moved forward in implementing the leaders' declaration that was achieved in September, or how should we move forward? At the same time, this kind of a meeting provides also great impetus to that implementation. Second very relevant thing here is that some things have happened since the September summit meeting happened.
Yes.
For example, there was a UN General Assembly meeting. There was also global summit for sustainable development goals stock taking. And there's a general understanding of these lagging behind their targets. Of course, we had now Hamas and Israel war in the meantime. The good news is that simply hours before the summit meeting opened today, both Israel has agreed with Hamas for 4-day ceasefire. That's a great news. And of course, another difficult relationship that India had lately seen was with Australia. And there was some skepticism, and we saw that India has now agreed to open e-visas, particularly for business, medical, and conference purposes. Of course, for some categories like students, employment, tourism, journalism, film industry, and missionary activities, we are still holding back, saying that until safety of Indian diplomats is assured in Canada, then we'll open up completely. So both very positive initiatives, and the skepticism that Justin Trudeau will not join is no longer there. He's confirmed to attend. I'm sure he's attending right now. Of course, one major person that had not attended was President Putin. Kremlin has also confirmed he will be joining today's meeting. President Xi, of course, will not be joining, so we will have the Chinese Prime Minister joining it.
Yes.
So I think it's an enormous transformation which India's presidency has brought in and built into the whole structure and process of how G21 will function from now. And therefore, I think India's imprint is going to be very visible in coming years.
Okay, coming back to you. So Swaran Singh, Prime Minister Narendra Modi in his address right now said that under India's presidency, the G20 has spread the message of inclusivity to the world and that the world has consequently heard the voice of the global south. Would you consider this as a very significant achievement?
Indeed, in addition to the ambassador's summary of Prime Minister's speech, let me say I think the fundamental point that he tried to make was how India's presidency has really helped repose confidence in multilateralism at the global level. And in that sense, that is a very positive contribution at the global level in terms of global governance, global decision making. Second very significant point which he underlined as India's contribution was to focus on human-centric development. And that is where this whole Indian narrative on DPI's, digital public infrastructure, is fundamentally changing the narrative on technology transfers that we have seen for the last 200 years. Technologies controlled by developed nations were invariably very difficult for others to obtain, or they were very costly for others to obtain. India is offering its online platforms, whether it is CoWIN or it is digital platforms for payments, e-commerce, for free. And so many nations of the global south are already incorporating that technology into their everyday life. So technology-driven transformation is what he's underlined in terms of his human-centric development approach, which is where he brought out both the advantages and disadvantages of artificial intelligence. He cautioned world leaders to be careful of the negative impact that AI could have, but also therefore to focus on integrating AI into positive transformation, and underlined and invited world leaders to join the next month's Global AI Partnership Summit that he mentioned in that sense. So I think it's a fundamental transition that in the way world has functioned so far, which is where he was explaining what is India's contribution. And I was really happy to see he mentioned in detail of how India looks at what is happening in the Middle East right now. He also underlined the fears that it could expand to the region, as he mentioned, and we must make sure this doesn't expand to the region, because you remember we have 9 million Indians. 9 million Indians live in that region, and we don't want war to expand. Second, he made a very fine distinction in saying we must oppose terror and violence. It's not just one-sided. Any innocent life lost is unacceptable. He underlined that in that sense. So I think it's a very well calibrated,
response,
fine distinction that his speech has underlined. And I think that is where India's contribution is, that we are able to nuance our narratives, nuance our worldview, and therefore make some of the very basic and fundamental changes in how global governance must happen, in which, of course, we keep saying repeatedly that the bringing global south to center stage has been one major success of India's presidency. And of course, in that same sense, pushing forward AI in transforming social life of people. And he mentioned of the social impact fund that he has proposed now, which, as Ambassador mentioned, we are pledging about $25 billion right now for the fund. It could expand in future. And of course, I think this could be a parallel example to climate crisis and climate fund, which has been a kind of disillusioned reality of $100 billion being, offered and proposed in 2005. Nothing has come about even today. So whether India's initiative on starting a similar social impact fund can look at a parallel example, that here is a small effort which is bearing the fruit, and the other ambitious, thing has not delivered. You mentioned of green credits, for example, moving to hydrogen, transition to, sort of whole alternative economy and alternative fuels in that sense. So I think there's a whole lot of package in a very terse speech that Prime Minister has made right now. As Ambassador said, underlining achievements, but also underlining the challenges that lie ahead of us, and underlying initiatives that India wants to take in coming years to deal with those challenges.
Okay.
looking at the Prime Minister insisting to the international community at large, talking about the Israel-Hamas armed conflict not turning into a regional conflict. Is that a bigger issue? Or the motto that we believed in, especially on Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the world is one family, taking that thought forward, in the new challenges that have emerged post the G20 summit that India hosted?
Anil, India today is seen as a rising power, and world has both expectations from India, and India also have responsibilities in terms of engaging with what is happening in Middle East for various reasons. First of all, it's very unusual. For the first time, India is friendly to all the West Asian countries, from Egypt to Iran to UAE to Israel to Saudi Arabia, countries that sometimes don't talk to each other are all talking to India. Therefore, in September of 2021, when President Joe Biden wanted to start a second Quad for West Asia, he brought in UAE, Israel, US, and India. So, world has expectations as to what is India thinking on what is happening in the region right now. Second, as I just mentioned before you came in, 9 million Indians live in that region. So, India would not like to see this conflict expanding into a regional crisis. Already, world is talking about how this Hamas-Israel war has derailed a process of rapprochement started by Abraham Accords between Israel, Bahrain, and UAE. Now Saudi Arabia was joining it. It's derailed clearly. But equally derailed is a very important initiative that G20 saw in September. India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. So India has both responsibilities and stakes in ensuring that this conflict doesn't prolong, doesn't expand. But let me say, India's approach to the conflicts like this, you remember the Ukraine crisis as well, has been one of proactive neutrality, not to take any sides. So just as you saw, Prime Minister mentioned, we condemn any act of terrorism of any kind. He also said we must oppose terrorism and violence. And any death of innocent people is unacceptable to India. So it's a very calculated, balanced, objective statement that we are seeing Indian Prime Minister making. We are also aware that India has already sent 2 consignments of humanitarian assistance to Gaza, along with talking to President Abbas at the same time, of course, talking to Prime Minister Netanyahu, because Netanyahu is a very close friend of Indian Prime Minister, so they have very good understanding with each other. So very, very nuanced approach of ensuring balance in how India wants to look at the conflict, how India wants to see that. But I understand, as Ambassador said, it's an economic forum. But when world leaders meet, they discuss such issues all the time. Already 5 national leaders of the G20, Italy, Germany, France, UK, and of course President Joe Biden of United States, have already physically visited Tel Aviv. Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State of United States, have gone there 4 times in 4 weeks. So global leaders are very seriously engaged. That this is an issue up on their mind as a very significant issue, and I'm sure this issue will be discussed very clearly in the G20 summit meeting. And therefore, I saw Indian Prime Minister spending fair amount of time in outlining how is India looking at that issue and how India wants to see that resolved. And we are of course starting with a very positive note. Just few hours before, Israel has already agreed for a ceasefire for 4 days with Hamas. For a long time, nobody was believing Israel will have any negotiations with Hamas because they were saying we want to eliminate Hamas. But now today we see that finally 4 days of ceasefire has been agreed, which means humanitarian assistance will be now moving into Gaza. We will see release of at least the first 50 hostages to be released. And Indian Prime Minister said we look forward to more being released likewise. So at least there is a pause button being pressed at that, constantly destructive conflict. Everybody was fearing it could expand to other regions as well. But luckily, pause should help both sides to rethink and global leaders to get really active in intervening, influencing, and engaging those actors on the ground to make sure violence is mitigated or at least stopped, as much as possible. And some kind of, stability, if not solution, is found as soon as possible.
Especially when it comes to the G20 consensus on tripling renewable energy capacity globally by 2030. As we dip into the COP28 summit that takes place in the Middle East, do you see more and more countries ready to open their purse and help or contribute towards tackling this issue?
I really hope so that India's presidency would contribute in building that consensus and political commitment of national leaders. That is where this second summit to stock take as to how have we moved forward or how should we move forward, because G20 is a grouping. The final declaration is not necessary to be implemented by everybody. They have to go home, do national level efforts, whether in regional forums or at the national legislatures, to implement that consensus that has been built here, including consensus on transition, energy transition that you mentioned. Of course, the fact that India's initial initiative of International Solar Alliance has received such global endorsement, 100 plus countries are now in that alliance, and now the second global biofuels coalition being launched here, are initiatives that India is taking by ensuring that wherever India can contribute in terms of transferring Indian technology to others, to make sure there is a complementarity in relationship. That kind of effort, I think, is what India can do. Whether the developed world is willing to now begin to transfer finance or technology and help the world in energy transition in that sense, we'll have to see that. But I think India is not leaving any stone unturned in that sense and pushing that agenda forward. I assume world is realizing, countries of the Middle East are realizing. You see the way they are drifting in terms of building new areas of investments for future growth for themselves. They are aware of the fact that gradually this energy transition is going to be the only choice world has. Already you see world scientists are no longer talking of bringing the global temperatures to 1.5. They are now talking of 2 degrees Celsius, which means a lot of climate crises are already irreversible in that sense. And that realization should push these leaders now to, come to taking initiatives. And the global finance, climate finance, which is an issue lingering for more than 15 years now, should be now move forward in that sense. Transfer of technology and finance should happen finally. India is showcasing by example is what I'm underlining.
Okay, one thing, is India's presidency going to be a tough act to follow for Brazil?
I am not saying that, Anil. You heard President Lula when he accepted in September, he said that himself. It's going to be a difficult sort of model to follow as Brazilian had himself. So it's clearly recognized that India has put an enormous effort, and of course there is always one can be very ambitious, as the Prime Minister had said in December of last year. But enormous transformation has already come about, and my hope is that transition that India is making sustain itself, because coming 2 presidencies are with Brazil and South Africa, which to me is IBSA. India has worked with these 2 countries, and I think that the Troika relationship will be able to carry forward the transitions and transformation that India has brought about in global decision making as far as G21 is concerned.
Okay, it's a fruitful discussion that we've had. Thank you all 3 gentlemen for taking time out, joining us on this special broadcast. Ambassador J.S. Mukul, Professor Swarn Singh, and Akshay Dongre.
So, Professor Swaran, the same question to you. How far will Prime Minister Narendra Modi's dynamic leadership of the G20 movement influence other leaders who take over this presidency now?
I think that if you recall the speech made by the President of Brazil in accepting the presidency in September, he clearly underlined how difficult challenge it would be for Brazil to sort of match up to India's presidency. And I think apart from being modest, he was also underlining something that is a reality. As far as Indian Prime Minister is concerned, it goes without. I mean, he is right now one of the most visible and indeed most influential leaders around the world now. In some of the surveys that you see, he's been often also described as the most popular leader around the world. And that really speaks of his personal efforts, the footwork that goes, and of course the entire team that works with him to make sure that he keeps building personal connections with world leaders. Now let's look at G20 summit meeting. Other than the fact that, we had large number of meetings and so on and very, extensive declaration, remember, announced at the end of very first session, Ambassador would wear me out. Most of such summit meetings have to sometime their last session so that consensus can be built. No, that is the kind of leadership that is very, very, really remarkable in that sense. Other than focusing on large number of issues, building consensus. Remember, I think reports were that he had about 15 bilateral meetings during those 2 days, other than the summit meeting.
Yes.
And remember the personal touch of taking all the leaders to Gandhi Samadhi. And in that sense, projecting India in terms of father of the nation, democracy of India's tradition being 7,000 years old, the costumes, culture, dance, music, a whole lot of things. I think it takes a lot of thinking that goes behind such things. And I think in that sense, it's a holistic approach to build not just official political relationships and partnerships, but building friendships with global leaders. I think Indian Prime Minister has showcased capacity to do that kind of personalized attention to each of the guests in that sense. Sometimes even indicating displeasure, and that's a very important thing. The body language also in diplomacy is very significant, particularly at apex level summit meetings. So each gesture, each word, each activity has to be carefully calibrated. And in that sense, I think of Prime Minister being directly engaged with each of these details himself, and of course carrying himself very, very comfortably with all kinds of world leaders in all kinds of situations, dealing with all kinds of issues, has really, as I said, we may agree or not agree in terms of influence he wields, but there is no doubt he's the most visible leader as of now. And I think that really brings far more upfront when you see him hosting the G20 summit meeting, where, as I mentioned, not just the 20, 19 economies plus European Union, but also the way your African Union again was just brought in as a permanent member in the very first session itself before the summit meeting began. I mean, he had done the footwork. Indian team had done the footwork or work behind it to make sure it's not a proposal to be presented, but it's something, a decision which is to be implemented when the summit meeting takes place. 11 international organizations were represented, 9 guest countries were represented. Put together, let me just say G20 today with EU 27 countries and 55 members of African Union is almost 100 countries together. I mean, it's a mini United Nations now. So leading that kind of powerful economies at the same time, 2/3 of global population being represented here, that I think is an enormous opportunity, and India, I think, has done very well in harnessing that unique opportunity
and strengthening the group of the G20 also. Request you